Thanks for coming. Please be seated. I am pleased to introduce Professor Robert Berman to the St. John's College community. I had the good fortune to study Hegel's philosophy of right with Professor Berman when he taught a class at Tulane University, but also had the good fortune to be a colleague of his for a brief time at Xavier University, where he now teaches. Mr. Berman comes from a tradition that for some of us is very much our own. He has studied with a few students of Martin Heidegger, for example, Hans Jonas, Hannah Arendt, as well as Leo Strauss's student Seth Benedetti. His thinking about Hegel, as will become clear shortly, will help us to understand the importance of Hegel on our program, perhaps in a new and somewhat exotic way. Professor Berman has written numerous essays on Hegel and is completing a book tentatively titled Self-Knowledge on Trial, the Argument of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. I need to mention that Mr. Berman has intentionally prepared a lecture that is relatively brief for a 500-page book, and he told me he much prefers the conversational setting after the lecture, so I hope you will all attend that. For unrelated reasons, the question period will be taking place in this room rather than the junior common room. So after 10 minutes, come back here. We're going to set the chairs up a little differently and have a conversation. So please welcome Professor Berman.
So let me start by thanking Michael for inviting me and for his introduction. I've known many people over many years connected with the St. John's students and friends and colleagues, and I finally have an opportunity to actually come to St. John's, so I'm rather happy about that. My title is the following: Self-Knowledge on Trial, a concise guide to the argument of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit of 1807 is a book preeminently about knowledge, above all, self-knowledge. It conducts a thought experiment designed to probe the prospects of philosophy as the quest for a distinctive kind of knowledge, which has as its aim to arrive at the truth about reality. This intention Hegel shares with Kant, who a quarter century earlier had urged philosophers to halt their pursuit of this kind of knowledge, the rational cognition of things in themselves, which he identified as metaphysics, in order once and for all to determine whether it is even possible. While heeding Kant's call, however, Hegel's way of answering it is more Socratic than Kantian. For Hegel's phenomenological inquiry is not at all an enterprise of the same kind as the knowledge project it subjects to scrutiny. That undertaking Hegel attributes to an epistemic protagonist he calls consciousness. By that he means, to state the bare minimum most simply, a structure of opposition between a cognitive subject and its object. Like Socrates, who examines his interlocutor's opinions without making any commitments of his own, Hegel is at pains throughout the phenomenology to maintain a bright line of demarcation between the internal perspective of consciousness, the actor or participant engaged in the quest for knowledge, and the external point of view of the phenomenologist, the spectator or observer. The phenomenologist describes and critically evaluates the shapes of consciousness that represent a series of attempts by this epistemic agent to succeed in reaching its epistemic goal. The argument that Hegel develops, the argument that develops as Hegel analyzes these efforts breaks down into two segments of unequal length. The shorter portion culminates with consciousness identifying the knowledge it seeks with self-knowledge. It is followed by a second part, vastly longer in length, which examines the shapes of consciousness that consciousness takes in its attempts to justify its claim to self-knowledge. As it moves through these two phases, the argument of the phenomenology ultimately leads to the conclusion that the project of metaphysics inevitably fails, owing to its fatal adherence to a set of premises rooted in the structure of consciousness. In the short argument, consciousness founders, because that structure is logically incompatible with self-knowledge. In the long argument, consciousness tries to avoid this logical difficulty by conjoining self-knowledge and the signature Hegelian concept of spirit. But since it cannot exclude its opposition structure, consciousness confronts an inconsistent triad and again comes to grief. The phenomenology tracks, in Hegel's famous phrase, a highway of despair. And it is self-knowledge that is central to his account. This, at least, is the thesis offered for your consideration tonight. As the inquiry progresses in the course of nearly 500 pages, the phenomenology covers a seemingly all-encompassing content. In the first quarter of the work alone, its topics range from sensation, perception, and the search for explanatory scientific laws, to life and desire, the existential struggle for recognition, lordship, and servitude, from stoic detachment and self-consuming skepticism, to despair over the failure of asceticism, assuaged only by surrender to a mediator who represents a transcendent authority. In the remainder of the book, Hegel turns his attention to membership in political, moral, and religious community, closing with a brief retrospective surveying the steps that have led to the outcome of the inquiry. A quick glance at the table of contents shows this wealth of content ordered in 8 chapters, which are articulated into a tripartite division: consciousness, self-consciousness, and reason, with this last, reason, dividing in turn into 4 successive subsections: reason, spirit, religion, and absolute knowing. This schematic outline maps the trajectory of the 2 main phases of the argument as a whole. The shorter phase, comprising the first 4 chapters, starts with consciousness and peaks fairly quickly with the move to self-consciousness. At this point, Hegel observes, consciousness first enters, quote, the native realm of truth, unquote. The advent of self-consciousness simultaneously shifts the focus of the inquiry to self-knowledge, which could encourage the view that Hegel intends to identify them. Support for this belief would be forthcoming if self-consciousness were able to justify its claim to self-knowledge. Self-knowledge would receive its adequate expression in the shape of self-consciousness, and the argument of the phenomenology would reach an affirmative conclusion. Instead, the failure of self-consciousness belies the impression of its identity with self-knowledge. Rather than concluding the argument, it becomes the decisive pivotal link to the longer argument, which must continue probing the prospects for self-knowledge beyond the boundary of self-consciousness. If consciousness is going to keep alive what is from now on its self-knowledge project, it has to revive its efforts by assuming the shape of reason. The treatment of the 4 subsections of reason comprises the whole of the second phase of the argument, sprawling across the remaining 3/4 of the work and home to its increasingly rich content. Before tracing the main argument of the phenomenology, some additional remarks might be helpful to clarify Hegel's conception of consciousness, so essential to his inquiry. One could think of consciousness simply as awareness or wakefulness, In Hegel's usage, however, it is something much more specific. Its primary sense is cognitive, or even more precisely, epistemic. As already noted, at its core, it is a structure of opposition between two poles, the object as it is for consciousness, and the object as it is independent of its being known. A contrast, as Hegel sometimes puts it, between knowing and truth. This structure provides the framework for the quest for metaphysical knowledge that is under investigation. While the claim to know an object is essential to consciousness, being in this relation is merely a contingent property of the object itself. Let's dub this modal asymmetry the epistemic difference. Hegel's inquiry aims to determine whether the knowledge project undertaken within the horizon of this epistemic difference can succeed. In pursuing its goal, consciousness operates with the traditional idea of knowledge as justified true belief. To win justification for a claim to know the truth requires appeal to an epistemic norm, a criterion specifying what counts as epistemic justification. Any theory of knowledge, or epistemology, must supply this criterion as part of its account of what knowledge is, the class characteristic determining what it is to be a knower. As knowledge of knowledge, it necessarily claims reflexive self-knowledge. But there is a difference between attributing knowledge to another and ascribing it to oneself. In first-person self-attribution, one claims self-knowledge in two senses. Not only reflexive self-knowledge, so having a theory of knowledge, but also knowledge of oneself as a member of the class of knowers. In the Phenomenology, consciousness, the claimant to knowledge under investigation, adopts this first-person perspective, while the third-person perspective belongs to the phenomenologist as spectator. Given the Socratic strictures governing his spectator stance, in his examination of consciousness, the phenomenologist must refrain from introducing any epistemic criterion of his own. Were he to claim to know what real knowledge is, he would, in effect, become a pretender to the throne of metaphysics. The phenomenologist leaves it to consciousness to play epistemologist. It must devise its own epistemic criterion while assuming its role as the candidate whose claim to knowledge needs to be justified. This duality, let's call it the normative difference, between an epistemic norm providing the measure of genuine knowledge and a candidate, the knowledge claimant, has both poles anchored in consciousness. Accordingly, one can reformulate Hegel's thought experiment as the examination of first-person epistemic self-evaluation under the condition of epistemic difference. Maybe I should repeat that once more. That's kind of a bumper sticker formula. One can reformulate Hegel's thought experiment as the examination of first-person epistemic self-evaluation under the condition of epistemic difference. The project is a dynamic one in which consciousness repeatedly fails to pass epistemic muster by its own lights. And this dynamism points to one last contrast, essential to Hegel's conception of consciousness, which we can label the teleological difference. Consciousness is, to begin with, but a potential member of the class of knowers. Moving from potential to actual membership is an achievement. Consciousness must establish that its candidacy lives up to the dictates of its very own epistemic norm. Consciousness must demonstrate that it instantiates the class characteristic necessary and sufficient for membership in the class of knowers. Each time consciousness fails to accomplish that end, it must regroup and try again, revising not only its knowledge claim, but also the criterion by which it evaluates it. The standard that consciousness initially furnishes for itself takes the form of a theory of truth, which is its preconception of the object as it is in itself. However, for its first-person self-evaluation, consciousness needs more than a theory of truth. It must also provide an account of justification, which determines whether its claim to know can be stamped as real knowledge. This standard of justification is correspondence. If the object as consciousness encounters it or represents it corresponds to the truth, that is, to the way the object is in itself, as its own theory of truth pre-delineates it, then consciousness can legitimately claim to possess real knowledge. Consciousness operates then with two interrelated criteria. On the one hand, the primary truth criterion, its preconception of mind-independent reality, or what is in itself. On the other hand, the secondary criterion of epistemic justification, which is correspondence between its preconception of truth and the object as consciousness actually encounters it. Only if its encountered object corresponds to its preconception of truth can consciousness secure its successful candidacy, having justified its self-imposed standard of justification. To determine whether or not correspondence obtains, consciousness must compare its representation of the object as it encounters it with its theory of truth concerning the object in itself. To evaluate its knowledge claim in light of its twofold criterion of truth and correspondence, consciousness must be aware not only of the object, but of itself as well. Self-consciousness in this sense is built into the very form of consciousness itself. This conception of self-consciousness would dovetail nicely with an ordinary understanding of self-knowledge as introspective reflection. But it would fail to explain why, although all shapes of consciousness must engage in this familiar sort of reflection, Hegel only labels one of them with the label self-consciousness. There must be something more distinctive about self-consciousness as a unique shape of consciousness that enables it to perform its pivotal linking function in the argument of the phenomenology, to which I now turn. In describing the object of his phenomenological inquiry, Hegel speaks of the history of consciousness, but he does not pretend to be concerned with recounting events that actually happened. Two of the most well-known discussions in the book are inspired by fictional works, one dealing with Sophocles' Antigone, the other with Diderot's dialogue, Rameau's Nephew. The vignette of the Lord-servant relation, to which Hegel devotes only a few pages, has no historical pedigree, even if it is perhaps the most influential passage, thanks to Marx and his followers, who transformed it into the basis for a metaphysics of human nature and history. Hegel's history of consciousness is, as one could say with Rousseau, conjectural or hypothetical. All of its contents are chosen and configured with an eye towards their epistemic significance alone. They are ripe for phenomenological analysis solely as attempts by consciousness to attain metaphysics. In the drama that Hegel famously denotes, the dialectic of experience, one shape of consciousness after another passes in review in a sequence of deficient efforts. Each subsequent endeavor of consciousness to justify its claim to knowledge incorporates lessons learned from previous attempts, avoiding predecessor errors, even as it makes novel mistakes of its own. Hegel's diagnoses of this procession of failures reveal a typical pattern. Within any shape, consciousness progresses from the weakest to the strongest version of its knowledge claim under scrutiny, while maintaining allegiance to the same preconception of truth. In the transition from one shape to the next, the previously prevailing theory of truth is abandoned in favor of a new one. Consciousness never simply repeats a mistake. Its errors are always innovative and shape-specific. The brevity of the first phase of the argument, which begins with an analysis of the shape that Hegel calls consciousness, is due to the epistemic agent's quick realization that its cognitive encounters can never afford its direct access to the object, as it presumes. Rather, they are unavoidably mediated by its own conceptualizations. And since its perceptions are theory-laden, its claims accurately to represent the object in itself turn out to be claims to know an object of its own theoretical conjuring. Hence, consciousness is compelled to conclude that knowledge, if attainable, must take the form of self-knowledge. Consciousness proves incapable of attaining self-knowledge, however, in its new guise of self-consciousness. The fundamental problem plaguing consciousness in this new shape is its view that knowledge has to default to self-knowledge for the sole reason that according to its theory of truth, there can be nothing other than itself to be known. Yet, as a structure of opposition, consciousness must adhere to the premise that knowledge is of an object in itself, independent of consciousness. Self-consciousness holds a theory of truth that rejects any objective reality other than itself. As consciousness, however, it must grant just such a realm of objectivity. If knowledge can only be self-knowledge, yet knowledge must nevertheless be of an independent object, then self-knowledge cannot be achieved in the shape of self-consciousness. As the argument of the phenomenology pivots from this immediate upshot of its shorter segment to the longer, consciousness in the shape of reason inherits this challenge. How can the opposition of consciousness be conjoined to self-knowledge without implying a self-contradiction? Reason as a shape of consciousness exhibits all the formal features that define consciousness as such, starting from the epistemic difference between consciousness and its supposedly mind-independent object. It must justify its claim to knowledge by establishing correspondence between the two sides of the opposition through a process of self-valuation in which it measures itself against the standards of its own provenance. What is unique and peculiar about reason's theory of truth, however, is that it implies the denial of the opposition of consciousness. For, according to reason, it belongs to the very nature of the object in itself, that it is identical to the object as represented by consciousness. It is in principle impossible for the object as it is in truth to be other than what it is for consciousness, and vice versa. But this excludes the epistemic difference that defines consciousness as a structure of opposition. Reason's theory of truth, therefore, entails the elimination of consciousness as the privileged condition for attaining knowledge. This logical implication has its full impact when combined with the strict limitation of all knowledge claims to those of self-knowledge. For it adds to reason's theory of truth the critical qualification that the object of knowledge can only be the self. Three critical implications follow. First, an ontological implication. The sole object of knowledge is ultimately the self-knowing knower. But at a minimum, the object to be known can have only those properties that the self of the knower takes itself to possess. The second implication is an epistemological one. Knowledge of this exclusive object depends entirely on consciousness coming to know what precisely those characteristics are that constitute its self. To attain self-knowledge, consciousness has to learn about the nature of itself, again, ultimately, as constituted by epistemic properties. Finally, third implication, rational self-knowledge has an anti-dualist implication. It is not possible for there to be two different selves, one of which is the object as encountered, and the other the self as it is in itself. Reason can justifiably claim self-knowledge if, but only if, what it encounters does not imply a real or true self that is other than the self that it takes itself to embody. Hegel encapsulates these three implications in his preliminary sketch of the shape of reason. Using the term idealism, he first characterizes reason as, quote, the certainty of being all reality. Given the reduction of knowledge to self-knowledge, there is in principle no reality to be known other than the reality of the self of reason. Whatever, again by reason's own lights, whatever it discovers itself to be. The idealist's claim of reason is not just to know reality, but to be itself the very universal reality that it claims to know. Precisely as a shape of consciousness, however, reason still presumes the epistemic difference between what is for consciousness and what is in itself. And that supposition of mind independence is in stark conflict with reason's defining theory of truth, according to which there is and can be no such irreducible difference. The decisive step in the long argument in the Phenomenology comes with reason's attempt to solve the problem it inherited from self-consciousness by taking on the shape of spirit. The meaning of this quintessentially Hegelian term, the German is Geist, is expressed in Hegel's pithy formula, the I that is we and the we that is I. Spirit, the term spirit, designates this royal we. And when one says, we know, the royal we stands in for every knower. Incorporating spirit into the phenomenological inquiry extends new hope to the seeker of self-knowledge by suggesting the following strategy. First, the epistemic agent must restrict the object of its knowledge claim to what is an I. Since the one claiming knowledge is himself an I, the epistemic relation is in the broadest sense a social relation among I's or selves. If furthermore the encountered object is not only an I, but the same as the knowledge claiming I, then the claimant can justifiably hold that in knowing the object, he has achieved self-knowledge. Of course, the object I cannot be numerically the same as the knowledge claiming I. After all, there must be a difference. So it can only be the same in kind. An I that is we must be a differentiated instance of the same kind as its fellows. There must be a property or set of properties that both the object I and the knowledge claiming I instantiate, which makes them members of the same class. But their joint instantiating of a shared class characteristic cannot be only for the phenomenological spectator looking on at the members of the class from an external point of view. It must be known from the internal point of view. Spirit implies the participants' reciprocal recognition, and they enjoy that mutual recognition because the class characteristic they share is a relational property, a function of their interaction with one another. Spirit provides an interpretation of reason's claim to be all reality in the shape of a self that knows itself in the object, which is constituted by all the members of the same class. This is what Hegel means in stating that spirit is, quote, aware of itself as its world and of its world as itself, unquote. If the epistemic agent under phenomenological scrutiny were simply unalloyed spirit, metaphysics at this point would become actual, with self-knowledge achieved in the form of reciprocal recognition, finally freed from the inconsistency stemming from the conjunction of self-knowledge and the opposition of consciousness. But spirit is still a shape of consciousness, and thus is tainted by the epistemic difference between consciousness and the alien object it claims to know. The long argument of the phenomenology will end with this core diagnostic claim. The very idea of spiritual self-knowing as a shape of consciousness is self-contradictory. Hegel reaches this conclusion by inspecting a variety of ethical, moral, and religious configurations that display this intractable problem of an alien reality that frustrates the metaphysical claim to spiritual self-knowledge. In reason's first spiritual shape, ethical community, the members of the we share common characteristics through their willing conformity to law, which codifies the rules governing their interrelations and defining their role identities. The class members know themselves and through their relations to one another precisely because who they are spiritually is determined by the same set of rules they all accept and enact. The problem, however, is that ethical community is constituted by two conflicting codes of law, reflecting the opposition of consciousness. Hegel exposes this difficulty in his memorable interpretation of the tragic clash between Antigone and Creon, who individualize the irreconcilable conflict between the family governed by divine law, grounded in a transcendent, inscrutable authority, and the city ruled by human law. In the immediately following subshape of spirit, Hegel shows that the relations between state and civil society suffer from their own forms of opposition, reflected in a variety of experiences of alienation. Markets create both artificial needs and desire for wealth necessary for their satisfaction. Social and political institutions demand conformity to their constitutive rules, which highlight the contrast between the givens of nature and the imperatives of convention that mold and suppress them. A turn to piety provides no path of liberation from worldly alienation. For faith's postulation of another world in which the individual is sure to know his true self only heightens the awareness of his presumably false self, inescapably rooted in this world from which he wants so desperately to flee. Nor, finally, can the alienated spirit overcome its internal division by claiming for itself an enlightened, universal self that transcends all natural and conventional differences. Reason's claim to be all reality now sparks the practical demand for revolutionary action to found a political order corresponding to that universal selfhood, which makes families, markets, and private civil institutions strictly impermissible. Enforcing the prohibition against them entails terror. This is the awful price consciousness pays for its attempt to complete its quest for self-knowledge by abolishing all differences among selves that frustrate the realization of its political project. In the final shape of spirit, the moral view of the world, which lies beyond the limits of political idealism, Hegel uncovers yet another manifestation of the opposition of consciousness standing in the way of spirit's self-knowledge. Here, the imperatives of the moral law, valid for all rational beings, which consciousness claims to find within its own rational self, conflict with the reality of brute nature, both internal and external. This independent alien domain of reality, which simply will not bend exhaustively to the demands of moral duty, presents the ultimate obstacle to moral self-knowledge that spirit cannot overcome. Consciousness insists that its moral self is the sole reality. To justify its claim will require completing the never-ending task of the moralization of nature and the naturalization of morality. Renewing one last time its quest to achieve metaphysical knowledge, reason initiates a final attempt in the shape of religion to reconcile spiritual self-knowledge with the formal opposition of consciousness. Despite avoiding all its predecessors' mistakes, this gambit too proves unsuccessful, bringing to a close the long segment of the argument, I should say, and with that, the main argument of the phenomenology as a whole. Religious consciousness claims knowledge of itself as spirit, hence self-knowledge of its membership in the class of self-knowers. While construing religion in these terms through his phenomenological lens, Hegel at the same time exploits the traditional view of divine omniscience, inferring that the core claim of consciousness as religion is to know itself to be God. This is a new formulation of what would amount to the attainment of metaphysics. For if divine omniscience is perfect knowing, God would be the successful epistemologist who attributes to himself the justified true belief that he is a member of the class of self-knowers because he instantiates the class characteristic defining self-knowledge as determined by his theory of knowledge. In its most complete subshape as the religion of revelation, the bold claim of religion is tantamount to the first-person assertion, I am God. This assertion, in fact, encapsulates a set of three interrelated claims. First, consciousness knows what God is, namely self-knowing spirit. Consciousness knows, secondly, of a human being who knows himself to be the incarnation of God. And thirdly, consciousness knows that having knowledge of that incarnate God is its own attainment of self-knowledge. In short, consciousness claims to know itself to be the self-knowing God incarnate. The grand claim of the religion of revelation, in other words, is that the religious knower, in knowing himself to be God, has at last grabbed hold of the holy grail of metaphysics. Why then does this final shape of religious consciousness fall short? For the simple reason that as consciousness, operating within its oppositional framework, religion reifies its object, transforming what it claims to know as its very self into an alien being. It claims that God appears to it in the guise of a single living human being, instantiating natural, not spiritual properties, subject to the vicissitudes of space-time and natural decay. With the death of the would-be divine human, members of the spiritual community are no longer eyewitnesses to his presence. They must resort to the cognitive medium of representation, what Hegel calls a mix of thought and sensation, to imagine the departed incarnate deity. They can only aspire to liken themselves to his image, looking with hope to a future in which they too will undergo the same transfiguration. Until that time, or rather, until time is extinguished, the once incarnate God remains beyond of another kind, not constituted through interaction with the fellow members of the class, and not one with whom they can identify. Religion is left bereft of a justification for its ambitious claim to spiritual self-knowledge. The phenomenological investigation of the vicissitudes of religion leads to the diagnostic insight that its failure to achieve self-knowledge of spirit is due solely to its attempt to do so under the auspices of epistemic difference. Further progress in the quest for metaphysics is impossible, since the only way to avoid the problem is to jettison the opposition of consciousness altogether as the privileged framework for knowledge. Yet one last shape of consciousness emerges from this conclusion, which Hegel labels absolute knowing. Should this highfalutin name be taken to suggest that, on the contrary, consciousness can finally achieve metaphysical success? Hegel nowhere states or even implies that absolute knowing should be construed to mean knowing the absolute. In one of the two passages where he actually uses the expression, the absolute, he likens it disparagingly to a black hole-like abyss that swallows up all distinctions, echoing the sarcasm of his well-known comment from the preface to the Phenomenology about, quote, the night in which all cows are black, unquote. If success of the project under investigation in the Phenomenology is still defined from the internal point of view of consciousness, as it has been all along, the achievement of metaphysical knowledge within the framework of epistemic difference, the terminal chapter of absolute knowing offers a negative answer. If, on the other hand, success is understood from the external phenomenological point of view, diagnostic insight into the causes of the necessary failure of the knowledge project under scrutiny, then Hegel's thought experiment has conducted a successful probe with a final, unequivocal result. Absolute knowing as the final shape is immunized against the one remaining but fatal mistake of its predecessor religion. It recognizes that it cannot consistently hold that spiritual self-knowledge is knowledge of a relation-independent object in itself. But given the consciousness-based definition of knowledge, absolute knowing is, as Hegel states, no knowing at all. Its achievement consists rather in an act of recollection through which it reconstructs for itself an etiology of the path that has led to the demise of the metaphysical knowledge project. It sloughs off, at last, the opposition of consciousness and ceases to be a shape of consciousness at all. In its retrospective glance, it converges with the phenomenological point of view and shares in the phenomenologist's insight. Now, my very brief conclusion. The argumentative course of Hegel's thought experiment, internalized by absolute knowing, concludes with the recognition that the quest for metaphysics is doomed to failure. Knowledge of the unchanging truth about being, reality in itself, not in a partial sphere, but as a whole, is strictly speaking impossible. But this is the wisdom that, according to the tradition-bred definition, philosophy is said to seek. Indeed, the Platonic Socrates at the beginning of the tradition finds the only worthwhile life to be one erotically driven, to strive for wisdom by an examination of opinion that aims to replace it with knowledge. Until this epistemic goal is achieved, philosophers in the Socratic mold have at least human wisdom, knowledge of their ignorance. The Socratic is vulnerable, however, to a radical skeptical attack using Hegel's phenomenological result as leverage. If the wisdom that philosophy seeks is simply identical with metaphysics, and that has been found to be impossible, the very idea of human wisdom is undermined as well. For the philosopher's animating desire is in vain. Such skepticism might allow the illusion of philosophy to persist, but only at the price of willful blindness to its absurdity. The Hegelian phenomenologist can rescue the Socratic from this threat by rejecting the skeptic's identification of wisdom with metaphysics. he can show at the same time that this radical skepticism is ensnared in its own dilemma. If the skeptic makes an absolutely global claim about the impossibility of knowledge as such, he faces self-destruction in the form of self-referential inconsistency. If, on the other hand, he confines himself to claiming only the impossibility of wisdom within the framework of consciousness, he merely mimics the insight of the phenomenologist. In that case, the skeptic belongs with his fellow Socratics in their achievement of genuine human wisdom, which retains its vitality, provided that it directs its philosophical eros towards a non-metaphysical wisdom. Thank you.